This is going to be the most biased Ripmo AF review you've ever seen. If you want to go back and look at sort of a general overview, take a look at my first video that I did on this bike, just my initial impressions, my short-term kind of review thing. I talk a lot about just the bike's characteristics, the build kit. I cover all of that in that video. I'm not reviewing this bike for its intended purpose anymore. I'm reviewing this bike for my intended purpose. I want to talk a little bit about where I ride this bike most commonly, and that's in Edmonton, Alberta. It's a cross-country city. And then I also want to go do big mountain. So I'm kind of looking for something either shorter travel or something bigger travel. And I've come up with a couple of different setups, and I've done a few modifications to get this to a point where I think it kind of does both things reasonably well. But as you would expect, it's a compromise. So let's talk about some of the changes that I've made. The first one, because it is kind of a cross-country bike for me, I wanted to put the XT shifter on there so I can get multiple drop shifts. The other thing that I noticed was I was getting a lot of pedal strikes, so I put 170 cranks on here. I wish I had gone to 165s, but they weren't available, so I made do. I also swapped out the original linkage for the Cascade Components link, and that's really the big change that I've made to this bike. Now, initially, my big complaint, especially when I would take the bike to the mountains, was just that I would blow through the rear travel very easily. It was the same issue that I had when I was on the Ripley AF. This is a specific feature that I want to talk about that's a really good example of where I would hit bottom on this bike before I got the Cascade link installed. By the time you landed, it's only 5 feet, and it would consistently be an issue for me with the new Cascade link. It's smooth as butter. I haven't had any issues with it. The Cascade Components link has resolved that issue. Basically, I do not know what the numbers are. I think it increases progressivity by like 12% or something. Like, it's not a small amount. It also adds some suppleness in the front of the stroke. And this has caused some challenges for me for sure, but it has its benefits. So let's talk a bit more about some of the challenges I've had with the Cascade links. One thing that's worth noting right out of the gate, I'm running an air shock. When you get the Cascade Components link installed, to get to a 30% sag rate, you have to use more air than you normally would. But if you've got like a 300 PSI max capacity in your shock and you're already using it on the stock linkage, this isn't going to work for you. So you do have to move over to either a shock with a higher capacity or to a coil. Something to keep in mind. But in general, just tuning this shock became kind of a different process. So my stock setup was 1 in the negative, 2 in the positive. I ultimately ended up coming back to 2 positive spacers, but I did remove that negative spacer. Now, the negative spacer in this shock is what controls sort of the initial stroke, right? So how easy is it for the shock to break away? Now, if I was going to leave that in, the negative spacer in, it was kind of harsh, small bump, and I wasn't really into it, so I pulled it. By removing that, the shock is a lot more active, and you do notice that when you're pedaling. So my solution to that has actually kind of worked to my advantage. I just throw it into the medium firm settings, and this has been awesome for riding cross country in Edmonton. It's still super snappy, but it gives you a lot more trail feedback. It really does feel like a shorter travel bike in that case, and that's sort of what I'm going for anyway. Now, I will still say on the cross-country side of things, the bike is big, right? It's pretty slack compared to a cross-country bike, and it's pretty long. To compare it to the Ripley, which was my previous bike, that was perfect in Edmonton. The Geo is so good. And it's only a half a degree steeper, but that half a degree actually makes a big difference. And also, you lose a lot of weight on the Ripley. This bike is very heavy. So through some of the tight stuff, it can be a handful, and it can be fatiguing because of that. So to accommodate some of that cross-country riding that is, again, the vast majority of what I'm doing, I decided to run a second tire setup. On the original rims that came with the bike, I am running a dissector up front and a forecaster in the rear. I haven't done a lot of messing around with sort of less aggressive tread tires, and these are quite aggressive still for what I'm doing. But because I haven't played around with this too much, I'm finding that running kind of a tire that's more likely to break away has actually been really good for my body position. And one of the things that this bike does really well is corner. And so in the cross-country trails, if I got opportunities to pick up some speed and then just try to throw this thing through flat corners super aggressively, it's forcing me to really throw my hips outside. It's helping me a lot with just being as stable on the bike as possible. And it's been like really fun to mess around with. So I think what I'm going to do is move the forecaster up front and put a Recon in the rear. And I think that's going to be my Edmonton tire setup, which will be a little bit faster rolling and super fun to just get loose on. On the other side of the equation, when you go into the mountains, I do also kind of have a mountain setup. So I ended up buying some We Are One convergence rims, and I've got those set up with an Assegai and a DHR2. I've really been appreciating the 30 mil ID on those rims. They're just a little bit more precise. I feel like I can carve a little bit harder. Other modifications that I make between sort of cross-country and downhill mode is really just cockpit based. I don't mess with my saddle. I don't mess with my pressures. I don't change my compression settings or my rebound settings. All of that actually stays the same with the exception of using the compression lever on the shock. What I do when I go to the mountains is I will leave the original stock 150 mil stem on here and I will run it 5 mil higher. When I get back into town, I will pull out that 5 mil spacer, drop the bars down a little bit further and swap the stem for a 40 mil stem. And that sort of coming back to my conversation about how long the bike is, how slack the bike is for cross-country trails, that does speed up the handling a little bit. What it also does is it sort of exacerbates this bike's tendency to have the front wheel lift. It's a difficult bike sometimes to get along with because when you're trying to dress it up as a cross-country bike, you're asking a lot of it. And yes, I would like the ability to stay seated on some steeper, punchier climbs. And unfortunately, that's just kind of not a great option. I do find that I'm hovering and sort of trying to find that balance point between the front and the rear. Oh, I should definitely talk a little bit about things that I am still kind of looking to change. I think for the most part, I do notice that when I'm in really steep environments or very fast bike park kind of stuff, the SLX brakes, I do really like them, but you have to work harder to get the power out of them. They're very strong, but you also have to be equally strong. And I've found myself in a couple of situations like riding at baseline where I'm halfway down just this relentlessly steep fall line trail and my hands are just cooked and there's nowhere to pull over and you just have to ride it out. But it's kind of a small gripe because I don't ride that sort of terrain very frequently. So for the most part, it still works really, really well. It's just something to keep in mind. Just to come back to the Cascade Link, it's added so much pop to this bike. It's made it so much more enjoyable to jump and to play with. And that's actually one of the things that I wanted to talk about is just how much a bike's character ends up influencing you as a rider. As the guy who would typically go out and hammer cross-country trails, getting on this bike with its weight, with its geo, I'm not inspired to go out and hammer. Like I'm not redlining every ride. I'm not constantly PRing. I'm not seeing that progression in my fitness, but I am seeing progression in my jumping and getting more comfortable on drops, sending bigger features. That's something that this bike has really inspired me to do. And I have to acknowledge that that's not 100% the bike. That's the bike mixing with my personality. But it's something that it allows me to do, and I'm happy to pursue it, considering that it's affording me that opportunity, you know?
I think this is another really good example of how the bike sort of changes how you want to approach a trail. So typically, if I was riding the Ripley, I would kind of be charging this section. It's just flat and flowing. Normally, this would be like hammer time. But on this bike, it's just not as fast to accelerate, and it doesn't inspire me to push hard here, so my tendency is just to kind of cruise. But it's a little bit disappointing, you know, like I do want to be inspired to push that little bit harder on the pedaling sections as well, and this bike just doesn't do it for me.
If I was going to ask Ibis to give me something on this bike, if they were going to update the frame and do something completely new coming into, I mean, they're obviously not going to do it coming into next year, but like maybe 2 years down the road, it would be adjustability. Because this bike has the, well, it would be drop a bunch of the weight, get the build kit down to a reasonable weight. This is 38 pounds. That's stupid for riding on cross country. Well, I guess with these tires, it's probably 36. It's a little bit more reasonable, but like get it to 32, 34, even in the all mountain mode. But give me some adjustments. I don't like, give me progressivity adjustments so I don't need to go out and buy a linkage, and give me head tube angle adjustment. If I could get this fork out in front of me another 1.5 degrees for riding downhill, or tuck it in under me another 0.5 degree or 1 degree, like getting that sort of a range, all of a sudden this bike, I don't need any other bikes. I will eventually get a shorter travel trail bike for riding in Edmonton. That makes more sense. I want something light and snappy. And I would still like a bigger bike when I get out to the mountains. But it's funny because I don't think I need much bigger than this. And if we had some of those geometry adjustments, for example, maybe this bike actually does work okay.
Okay, just a quick interruption. I realized that I didn't exactly state what my intentions were moving forward when I initially shot this video. And I definitely am going to be holding on to the Ripmo. I have no intention of letting it go yet. But the plan is to first get that short travel trail bike. And at that point, maybe I'll start playing a little bit more with some geometry adjustment that I can do on my own. Maybe look for an angle set. Maybe consider playing with increasing the travel. It turns out that the Ripmo is actually a pretty interesting platform with a lot of room to sort of mess around, especially if you're not overly concerned about maintaining the integrity of your warranty. But I'll leave that for another time.
I think I'm going to leave it there. Sorry if this was a little bit rambly. I have so many opinions on this bike, and I've thought so much about how I want this bike to ride and what sort of components I can bring in to make it do what I want it to do, that it's just verbal diarrhea when I start talking about this bike. And my thoughts are, as much as I've tried so hard to organize them, it maybe hasn't come across that way. So thanks for toughing it out. I hope that this was insightful. If you have any questions, definitely hit me up in the comments. I will try to answer all of them. Thanks again. We'll see you in the next one.